Hi, welcome back. um, Today I'm going to be reading out of this. It's called Mile High with a Vampire. It's been something I wanted to do for a while. Is read a book on here. So let's get into it. I had it marked for where I left off, but um, it's by Lindsay Sands. He's a boy on the um book though. Looks like a bad boy. Cool. There's no chapters, it just says one, but on my description it says chapter one. So. Quinn was torn from a deep sleep to find herself in a world of noise and echoes. Shivering, she peered around with confusion, trying to understand how it could be so cold in the middle of the summer and what was happening to cause the shivering and screaming going on around her. It wasn't easy to sort out at first. A bitter wind was slapping at her, taking her breath away. Oh, excuse me, and making her hair thrash and whip around her face. And sorry if I have a hard time reading these big words. It takes me a while. Intermittently, intermittently, um, sourcing her vision between that and the lights blinking on and off. She caught brief images of seats and small tables around her, as well as smaller loose items flying every which way. And then, in a brief moment, a light and no hair in her eyes, she spotted a cup flying toward her head. Quinn instinctively leaned sideways in her seat and turned her face around to avoid the image. That's when she spotted the women in the seats across the aisle from her own. Amazing, amazing in size. I don't know what that means, whatever. Both were screaming and clenching frantically at their armrests, their wide eyes focused on something ahead and a bit below them. The sight was enough to nudge her memory, and Quinn recalled that she was on a plane traveling from Italy to Canada. She swiveled her head to see what the women were looking at with such horror, and her own eyes immediately widened with dismay. They were looking at a hole about a square foot in size in the side of the plane. Their altitude was that opening where the source of the cold bristle wind swirling inside the cabin. Some part of her mind realized, but it was the position of the hole that caused most of her alarm. It was above the seats, along the wall, probably a smashed window, but it wasn't below the women because the plane was in the near nosedive, plummet, plummeting toward the earth. How had she missed that? The question had barely shot through her thoughts when something slammed into the side of her head. A surprised grunt of pain slid from Quinn's lips, and her head started toward the new sore spot on her scalp. But a second below from an unknown image made her give that up, and to simply bend forward. Below the cover provided by the seat backs, she bent until her chest rested on her knees, and she was staring at the carpet carpeted floor, and then covered the back of her head with her hands. It was what the flight attendants always said to do during those safety run-throughs at the start of every flight, and seemed the smartest thing to do now. Quinn had barely finished taking the position when she heard what sounded like an engine starting. It was only then that she realized the sound had been missing when she first woke up. The plane began to level off as if the pilots were fighting to get it out of its dive. She found herself holding her breath and listening to the engine with concern. It didn't sound like it had when they'd taken off. The steady hum it had been now sounded more like a stuttering cough, she thought, and then her breath left her on a second between a moan and a gasp when a violent shudder went through the plane. It was accompanied by a roar of ripping metal that seemed to come from all around as she was jolted painfully against her seatbelt. Gasping for breath now, Quinn looked toward the women in the seat across the aisle and blinked with confusion, followed by horror. A gaping hole had opened up along the side of the plane, and the women who had been seated across from her were gone, along with their seats and parts of the floor. All that was left was a view of the world outside the plane, dark night with a darker shapes of trees whizzing past as the plane started to spin. The trees whizzing past as the plane started to spin. They, I already said that. They'd managed to level out to late and were now careening, craning through what appeared to be a forest. Sure, they were all about to die. Quinn bowed her head and closed her eyes to pray. It was a simple prayer. Oh God, oh God, oh God, slipped from her lips in an almost silent litany of despair and pleading, and then the plane jolted again with another accom- hold on, big word. Accompaniment uh, of tortured metal before coming to a shuddering halt. Amazed to still be alive, Quinn sat up to peer around. Her gaze slid over the long rend in the side of the plane. It started where the broken window had been, went past where the two now missing women had sat, and stretched all the way to just before the back seats were the last two of her five companies on the flight. This flight were have now seating up to look around as well. It was like Some giant had reached out and peeled the wall of the plane away to look inside. She thought as she unsnapped her seatbelt. Trees rip wing off. Trees rip wing off. Take wall with it. Okay, that was a little weird. Quinn blinked at that grim explanation spoken with a heavy Russian accent and turned to the woman who had given it. Kara Sarka, the tall blonde, and her much smaller bodyguard, Lilia, were already out of their seats and at her side. You are okay, duh? Kara asked, her gaze skimming Quinn where she sat. Duh, Quinn murmured, and then cleared her throat and said, Yes, thank you. Are you okay? They looked fine, but they had been a lot of things flying around inside the plane. The cups and the glasses they've used and other items from the little galley between the cockpit and the passenger seat area. Sorry. She thought she'd even seen a laptop whiz past at one point. Not yet. We go find Nika, Marta, and Annika. You check pilots. Oh my gosh. Quinn frowned at the mention of the three women Marta and Nika had been, and the women in the seats across the aisle from her own. Annika had been farther back in one of the two seats and had faced Erica and Lilia. Those seats were now missing too. She saw as was the table that had been between the cordon of seats. She'd forgotten all about the third woman. Sorry for my stuttering trying to read this. This is so hard for me to do this. Wait, I'll come with you. They might be hurt and need me, Quinn said, standing up, but she paused to grab the back of her seat to steady herself as she became aware of how shaky her legs were. It was to be expected after an incident like this, but annoying just the same. Not yet. Immortals need no doctors. Mortals do. See to pilots, Kara ordered, and then was gone before she could protest further. Not that Quinn would have protested. Erica was right. As immortals, the Russian women who had been torn out of the plane wouldn't need assistance beyond blood or injured, but their pilots were mortal and would need her help if they were alive, she thought with concern as she slid into the what remained of the aisle and started toward through the destroyed cabin of the plane. That last shuddering jolt had brought them to a halt must have been the plane crashing into something, and the front of the plane where the pilots sat would have taken the brunt of the impact. Quinn wasn't at all sure what she would find in the cockpit. While she had the other two immortals hadn't been hurt, the air was heavy with the scent of blood, but that didn't mean anything. The galley was awash with the quick liquid, a result of the refrigerator falling open at some point during their crash and vomiting its contents everywhere. The blood bags it had held had burst against the walls and countered as they flew around, grimacing at her feet, squelching, squelched on the blood-soaked carpet. Quinn tried to mentally prepare herself for what was coming as she approached the door. Oh my gosh. Let's see where chapter 2 enters. Oh, we got like a lot more pages to go. So let's try and get through this. Shall we? We shall. Okay. Payne pulled Jet from unconsciousness, moaning at the bronchial pounding in his head. He blinked his eyes open with irritation and found the confusion at the scene around him. He was seated upright in semi-darkness with just the lit screens and a bunch of lighted bottoms on the instrument panel and center console to see by. It was enough for him to recognize that he was in the cockpit of a plane. Right, he thought a little fuzzily, working, flying a bunch of sheep hires from Europe back to Canada. They weren't flying now, though, he noted, as at least the hum of the engine was missing. Had they landed? Why did his head hurt? Christ, it must have taken a sleep on Miller, and Jet's thoughts died as he instinctively turned to look at the older man he'd agreed to co-pilot for on his flight. Jeff Miller was a good 20-year older than him, a damned fine man, and an excellent pilot. He had mentored Jet when he'd first started with Argonial Enterprises more than 4 years ago. Jeff Miller was someone Jet respected, and looked up to. He was also presently being attacked by one of the sheep hires. Get away from him! Leave him alone! Jet barked, grabbing the creature's arm to jerk her away from where she was bent over his friend and co-worker. The woman straightened and swung toward him at the other, and Jet gaped when he recognized her. He'd been told that there were shuttling some Russian princess type and her 4 bodyguards, as well as one American immortal, to Toronto, but had been doing the pre-flight checks when the woman had boarded. Miller had been the one to greet them. Jet had realized that Quinn Peters was the American. Now his gaze slid over her pale face and pentide future thing, figure. Sorry. Jet had first met the immortal on one of his first flights when she was called out to collect her big word Megurite or no, yeah, I have no idea what we're saying here. Let's go run through it. Note and Julius note from Albina, New York, and fly them back to Toronto. 6 months later, they had flown Quinn to Italy to live with her sister and son. He hadn't encountered her since, and looked her over now, taking in the changes time had round in her. They weren't physical. The beautiful Asian woman looked much as she had the first time he'd seen her. She was still small everywhere. Small nose, small pouty lips, small face with wide cheekbones. She didn't stand more than 5'2", though he suspected she was closer to 5 feet, and she was still so slender he had the urge to take her out somewhere and feed her. Everything about her was small, except her eyes. Those were huge, and a deep dark brown that was almost black, speckled with the silver flecks that gave her away her status, status, status as an immortal. So I'm going to stop there because we're on 23, 15, 16, 17 right now. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to end this video, and we are going to start on page 7 because we're now even close to being done with chapter 1. I thought we would be, but we are not. So, but on that note, I'm going to end this video, and we are going to start tomorrow morning, and well, hopefully when I get up. I do have school tomorrow, so I won't be able to do it at night. I don't know. It depends on how tired I am from school, for fireman school. So I have a speck on my computer. I will let you guys go, and I'll see y'all tomorrow. Stay frosty, y'all. Peace out, y'all.